Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of the most deliberately buried secrets in all of Western history. And I mean that literally. What we're going to explore tonight wasn't lost by accident. It wasn't forgotten because nobody wrote it down. It was buried, covered over, rewritten. And the women at the center of it, erased so thoroughly that for centuries we just accepted the story that replaced them. What if I told you that in the so-called Dark Ages, an era we picture as nothing but plague, poverty, and powerless women waiting to be married off some of the wealthiest, most legally protected, most genuinely free people in all of Europe were women who had no husbands? What if I told you that in London, in the year 1287, a woman named Margery, unmarried, answering to no man, no father, no guardian, owned 3 commercial properties in the heart of the city, maintained 2 residential estates, and was actively running one of the most profitable French wine import operations in the entire country? And what if I told you that her story, and the stories of thousands of women exactly like her, were so threatening to the social order that an entire machinery of law, language, medicine, and violence was eventually constructed over centuries specifically to make sure no woman would ever feel entitled to live that way again? That's tonight's story. I'd genuinely love it if you could hit that subscribe button, but only if tonight's journey truly fascinates you. No pressure. I just think what we're about to uncover together deserves to find as many curious minds as possible. And before we dive in, I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you right now? What city? What country? What time is it there? Are you already in bed with the lights turned low, maybe your phone propped on the pillow? Or are you winding down after a long day, waiting for your mind to finally go quiet? Maybe it's the middle of the night and sleep just isn't coming. Drop it in the comments, I read every single one. And honestly, knowing where you all are in the world makes this feel a lot less like a monologue and a lot more like a conversation. Your stories genuinely make my night. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, pull the blanket up a little higher, maybe put on some soft background sound, and let's step together into medieval Europe, a world stranger, richer, and far more complicated than anything they taught us in school. Picture this: London, 1287. Late autumn. You are standing on a narrow cobblestone street somewhere near Cheapside, the commercial heart of the city, and the air smells like wood smoke and river mud and the faint sweetness of bread baking somewhere you can't quite locate. The street is loud, not with cars or machines, but with people. Vendors calling out prices, horses, the clatter of wooden cart wheels on stone. Somewhere nearby, church bells are ringing the hour, and the sound bounces off buildings so close together that the upper floors nearly touch above your head, blocking out the grey November sky. You stop in front of a storefront. It's substantial, not a market stall, but a proper commercial establishment with a carved wooden sign above the door and goods displayed in the window opening. Wine, imported, French, expensive, and behind the counter, going over ledgers with the focused, unhurried confidence of someone who has done this 10,000 times, is a woman. She is maybe 35. Well-dressed, not extravagantly, but clearly prosperous. She speaks to a supplier in a tone that carries no apology in it. She reviews numbers, she makes a decision, she moves on. Her name is Margery. She is unmarried. She has always been unmarried. This shop is hers. So is the one 2 streets over. So is the one near the docks. So are the 2 residential properties she rents out for additional income. The wine she sells travels across the channel from Bordeaux through trade connections she built herself. Over years, through relationships she cultivated, contracts she signed, risks she took and calculated and took again. No husband approved these decisions. No father co-signed these contracts. No male guardian stood between Margery and the law. Under a specific and remarkable legal designation that medieval England actually had a name for Femme Sole, the sole woman, the woman standing alone, Margery had the full and complete legal right to own property, to trade commercially, to sue and be sued in court, to sign binding contracts, to travel without permission, and to make every financial decision affecting her life entirely on her own authority. She was, by any reasonable measure, free. Not free in the way we sometimes romanticize freedom, not wild or rootless or untethered. Free in the most practical, grounded, consequential sense of the word. Economically autonomous. Legally recognized, socially respected within her community, and, from everything the historical record shows us, genuinely content. Here's what will absolutely blow your mind about Margery's story. She wasn't exceptional. She wasn't a once-in-a-generation anomaly, a freak of circumstance, a lucky outlier. She was one of thousands. Records held today at the British National Archives Guild records, property registries, court documents, trade ledgers tell us that in medieval London, approximately 23% of commercial property owners were unmarried women, nearly 1 in 4, in a city that the popular imagination pictures as a place where women existed entirely under male authority. Almost a quarter of the commercial real estate was in the hands of single women operating independently under the Femme Sole designation. Let that number settle for a moment, 23%. And London wasn't unique. In York, in Bristol, in Norwich, in the great trading cities of medieval England, and across the Channel, in the wool towns of Flanders, the banking centres of northern Italy, the market cities of the German states, the pattern repeated itself. Women, unmarried, successful, legal, present. So how did we end up with a cultural image of the Middle Ages that contains almost none of them? That's the question that has kept historians like Sarah Butler at Ohio State University and Judith Bennett at the University of Southern California working for decades. And the answer, when you dig into it, is both fascinating and deeply unsettling, because the erasure wasn't gradual, it wasn't passive, it was engineered, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Tonight, over the next few hours, we're going to meet these women properly. We're going to walk through their shops and their courts and their communes. We're going to sit in the meetings where they built financial networks that spanned 3 countries. We're going to stand in the shadows of the institutions they constructed, schools, hospitals, guilds, housing cooperatives that functioned, in many cases, more effectively than anything run by men around them. And then we're going to look, very honestly, at what happened to them, why the story changed, how the machinery of erasure worked, what it cost, and what, quietly, stubbornly, refused to disappear entirely. Because here's the thing that keeps me coming back to this history, the thing I find genuinely remarkable every single time I read about it. These women knew something about how to live, something about what actually matters, something that was considered so dangerous that entire systems of law and medicine and language were rebuilt over centuries to make sure women stopped knowing it. And the fact that you're here tonight, the fact that this question is still alive and still urgent, suggests to me that maybe some part of it never entirely went away. The women we're about to meet tonight lived 800 years ago, but I promise you, by the time we're done, they are going to feel very, very familiar. Let's begin. The Femme Sole, a legal revolution. Here's something that doesn't get taught in almost any history class anywhere. Medieval England had a law, a real, functioning, court-recognised, commercially applied law. And what this law said, in essence, was this. If you are a woman, and you are unmarried, and you choose to operate as an independent trader, you have the same legal standing as any man. Full property rights, full contract rights, the right to sue, the right to be sued, the right to appear in court without a male representative speaking for you, the right to accumulate wealth and keep it, the right to make decisions about your own financial life without asking anyone's permission. The designation was called Femme Sole, sole woman, woman standing alone, and it was not a loophole, not a technicality, not some obscure provision buried in legal footnotes that nobody actually used. It was an active, functioning part of medieval commercial law, applied regularly in the courts of London and York and Bristol, documented in guild records and trade registries going back to at least the early 13th century. And here's the kicker for the women who held this status: it worked. Let me show you what Femme Sole actually looked like in practice, because the gap between what we imagine medieval law allowed women to do and what the records actually show is frankly staggering. Picture this: York, England, 1360s. A woman named Agnes Sampson sits at the centre of what can only be described as a textile empire. She runs weaving operations across 3 countries, England, Flanders, and northern France. She employs more than 200 workers directly. She negotiates her own supply contracts with wool merchants in the Cotswolds, manages her own distribution arrangements with buyers in Bruges, and maintains her own financial accounts denominated in multiple currencies, with the precision and confidence of someone who has been doing international business for decades. Because she has. Agnes never married. This was not an accident, not a failure, not a tragedy she was quietly coping with. Historical records from the York Guild archives documents that legal historian Sarah Butler at Ohio State has spent years analysing show that Agnes Sampson was asked more than once about her unmarried status, and her recorded responses, in the careful administrative language of medieval court documents, amount to the same thing every time. She declined. Deliberately. Repeatedly. With evident satisfaction. She understood, with the clear-eyed practicality of someone who had built something real, exactly what marriage would cost her. And that cost was total. Because here's where the story gets genuinely dark. Here's what will absolutely stop you in your tracks when you understand the full picture. The same legal system that gave Agnes Sampson her remarkable freedoms as an unmarried woman had another designation for married women. And that designation was called coverture. And what coverture said, in essence, was the precise and exact opposite of everything Femme Sole offered. Under coverture, the legal doctrine governing married women throughout medieval and early modern England, a woman who married did not simply acquire a husband. She disappeared, legally, completely. A. Her legal identity merged entirely into his. She could no longer own property in her own name. Any property she had owned before the marriage transferred automatically to her husband's control. She could not sign contracts. She could not appear in court as an independent party. She could not conduct trade in her own name. She could not make financial decisions without his authorization. Legal historian Sarah Butler, whose meticulous work on medieval women's legal status has reshaped how scholars understand this period, describes the moment of marriage under coverture as a kind of legal death, not a metaphor or technical reality. The woman who existed in the legal record before the wedding simply ceased to exist after it. Her husband's legal identity absorbed hers entirely. She became, in the language of the law, a femme covert, a covered woman, hidden, subsumed, gone. Now think about that contrast. Hold both things in your mind at once. On one side, Agnes Sampson, unmarried, running a 3-country textile operation, sitting in guild meetings, signing international contracts, accumulating wealth that she owns completely and will pass on as she chooses, answering to nobody. On the other side, the woman Agnes might have become if she had married, a legal non-entity, a person whose name had been erased from every document, whose property had transferred to another person's control, who required her husband's permission to conduct any meaningful transaction. Same woman, same intelligence, same capabilities, same world, 2 completely different legal realities, separated by nothing more than a wedding. Is it any wonder Agnes said no? What strikes me most, every time I return to this material, is how economically sophisticated these women's decision-making actually was. Because the choice to remain unmarried wasn't romantic or ideological for most of them. It was a business calculation, a rational assessment of costs and benefits, a clear-eyed understanding that Femme Sole status was, financially speaking, simply the better deal. And the numbers back them up. The British National Archives hold records from the London Guild system going back to the early 13th century. These aren't literary sources, they're administrative documents, account books, membership registers, property records. Dry, precise, methodical. And what they show, consistently, across more than 2 centuries of documentation, is that unmarried women operating under Femme Sole status were not marginal participants in London's commercial economy. They were substantial ones. That 23% figure, nearly 1 in 4 commercial property owners in medieval London being unmarried women, comes from these records. And when you break it down further, by trade sector, the picture becomes even more striking. In certain trades, textile dealing, food retail, money lending at smaller scales, the hospitality trades women operating independently sometimes constituted 30, 40, even 50% of practitioners. These were not women on the edges of the economy, they were embedded in its functioning centre. And here's what really gets me. Here's where the picture becomes not just economically interesting, but genuinely human. Because Femme Sole status didn't just give these women legal rights, it gave them something harder to quantify, but arguably more important. It gave them a recognised identity in the eyes of their community. They were known, they were respected. They had reputations built over years of honest dealing. They sat in guild halls. They participated in trade negotiations. They were called upon to give testimony in courts. They were considered, in the fullest sense of the word, people actors in the world, not dependents upon it. Take Isabella de Fortibus, a 13th century English noblewoman who, through a combination of inheritance and strategic independence, ended up controlling some of the largest private landholdings in England. What's remarkable about Isabella isn't just the scale of her wealth, it's the texture of how she managed it. She personally oversaw agricultural operations across multiple estates. She negotiated directly with crown representatives. She made decisions about land use, tenancy arrangements, and capital investment that shaped the economic lives of hundreds of people dependent on her properties. And she did all of this, according to historian Michael Altschul, whose research on medieval English nobility documented her case extensively, with what the sources describe as evident competence and satisfaction. There are no records of Isabella expressing longing for a husband to take these burdens from her. There are records of a woman who seems to have found her work genuinely interesting and her independence genuinely valuable. She lived a full life, a rich one, by choice. But wait, it gets better. Because Femme Sole status wasn't even the only pathway to independence available to medieval women. It was one of several. And when you start to map them all together, what emerges is a picture of medieval female autonomy that is so much more varied and resourceful than anything we've been taught to imagine. Widowhood, as we'll explore later tonight, offered its own remarkable form of liberation. The guild system, in certain cities and certain trades, allowed women to apprentice, to qualify, to hold full membership. The church, paradoxically, provided an institutional framework within which educated women could accumulate real authority. And then there was something else entirely, something that doesn't fit neatly into any category we'd recognise today. Something that was, in its time, arguably the most radical social experiment in the history of Western women. Now, the Femme Sole framework wasn't without its complications. The law was inconsistently applied. It varied by city, by trade, by the social connections a woman could call upon. It offered protection but not guarantee. And as we'll see when we get to the darker chapters of tonight's story, it was ultimately vulnerable to social pressure, to changing political winds, to the organised interests of men who eventually decided that female commercial competition was a problem requiring a solution. But in its moment in the 13th and 14th centuries, in the trading cities of medieval England and their continental counterparts, it created something real, a world in which a woman could build a life on her own terms, on her own credit, in her own name. A world in which the phrase unmarried woman did not automatically mean diminished, dependent, or defeated. A world, it turns out, that had to be actively dismantled. But before we get to the dismantling, I want to take you somewhere extraordinary. To the flatlands of northern Europe, to the wool towns and river cities of what is now Belgium and the Netherlands and northern Germany. Because somewhere in those cities, in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, a group of women were doing something that had never been done before in recorded Western history. They were building a world entirely of their own. The Beguines, the world's first feminist commune. I want you to imagine a city within a city. You're walking through Bruges, in what is now Belgium, sometime around the year 1320. The main city around you is wealthy and loud and complicated wool merchants haggling in the market square, guild masters in their fine houses, the constant political tension of a city that knows it's important and acts accordingly. It smells like dye and river water and horse. It sounds like commerce, but then you pass through a gate, and everything changes. On the other side of that gate is a separate enclosed community, its own streets, its own gardens, its own chapel, its own hospital, its own workshops. The buildings are modest but well maintained. There is an orderliness here, a quiet purposefulness that feels different from the city outside. Women move through the streets with the unhurried confidence of people who know exactly where they are going and why. Some are working at looms, some are tending the sick in the infirmary, some are reading, some are deep in conversation, the kind of intense intellectual conversation that you can recognise across 8 centuries just by the body language leaning forward, gesturing, fully present. No men live here. No men govern here. No men make decisions here. This is a beguinage. And what happened inside places like this is one of the most astonishing and least told stories in all of medieval history. Let's be precise about what the Beguines were, because they tend to get misclassified in ways that flatten their significance. They were not nuns. This is crucial. Nuns took permanent vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, and submitted to the authority of a religious order and, through that order, to the institutional hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Once you became a nun, you were in, permanently, under authority, within a structure designed and governed by others. The Beguines took no permanent vows. They could leave whenever they chose. They could marry if they decided to. They retained ownership of any property they brought with them. They governed themselves through their own elected leadership. They wrote their own rules. They answered, in their daily practical lives, to essentially nobody outside their own community. They also were not simply women waiting for marriage. The cultural tendency to categorize any medieval woman not currently married as premarital, as existing in a kind of holding pattern until her real life began, completely misses what the Beguines were doing. These were women who had examined the available options and constructed, from scratch, an entirely new one. They were, in the most literal sense, building something that had never existed before. The scale of what they built is what gets me every time. Every time I come back to this material, the numbers hit differently. By 1320, just to use that as a snapshot moment, historians estimate that more than 200,000 women were living in Beguine communities across northern Europe. 200,000. In cities and towns stretching from Cologne to Paris to Amsterdam to Strasbourg, these enclosed female communities had become a defining feature of urban life. In some cities, the numbers were extraordinary, even relative to total population. In Cologne, one of the great commercial cities of medieval Germany, historians estimate that by the mid-14th century, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the entire adult female population was affiliated with a Beguine community. Not a fringe phenomenon, not a curiosity, a major social institution. And these communities were not passive or charitable in their economic orientation. They were commercial powerhouses. Here's the data point that absolutely floors me. In the textile-producing regions of Flanders, modern Belgium, and northern France, Beguine communities collectively controlled approximately 60% of the high-quality cloth production by the year. 1,360%. Of an industry that was, at that moment, arguably the most economically significant manufacturing sector in northern Europe. The wool and textile trade was to medieval northern Europe roughly what oil is to the modern Middle East, the resource that everything else depended on, the industry that made cities rich, the commodity that flowed through every major trade route. And the Beguines, through decades of collective organization and relentless skill development, had made themselves indispensable to it. This was not charity work. This was not spiritual occupation keeping idle hands busy. This was a sophisticated, coordinated, intentional, economic strategy executed at scale. But here's where it gets really interesting, because the economic achievement, remarkable as it is, was only one dimension of what the Beguines constructed. What they had actually built, at its core, was a solution to a set of problems that every society in every era has struggled with, problems that we still struggle with today. AD 5. How do you balance meaningful work with a life that has room for thought and rest and friendship? How do you take care of people when they get old or sick, when they can no longer take care of themselves? How do you provide housing in expensive cities for people who don't have family wealth to fall back on? How do you create conditions where women can develop their talents and pursue their intellectual interests without those pursuits being constantly subordinated to someone else's needs? The Beguines solved these problems. Not perfectly, nothing human is ever perfect, but genuinely, practically, at scale. Their communities combined working cooperatives with shared housing. Members contributed their labour and skills to collective enterprises, the textile workshops, the hospitals, the teaching operations, and in return received housing, food, care when ill, and a social world of considerable richness and depth. Older members who could no longer work were supported by the community. Younger women arriving with nothing could earn their place through labour and eventually accumulate enough to live independently within the community's structure. It was, in the language we'd use today, a fully integrated mutual aid system, a cooperative economy, a social safety net. all of it designed, built, managed, and sustained entirely by women, for women, without male authority at any level of its operation. The scholar Walter Simons, whose landmark study of the Beguine movement remains one of the most comprehensive accounts we have, describes these communities as representing a genuinely alternative social organisation, not a protest against mainstream society, but a parallel construction of something better. And then there was the thinking. Oh, the thinking. Because the Beguines didn't just solve practical problems, they produced, from within their communities, some of the most radical and original philosophical and theological writing of the entire medieval period. Picture this. Paris, early 14th century. A woman named Margaret Perret is finishing a book. She has been working on it for years, refining it, sharing it with trusted readers who have passed copies among themselves across networks stretching through France and the Low Countries and into England. The book is called The Mirror of Simple Souls, and what it argues in language of extraordinary beauty and precision is that the soul, capable of true love, transcends the need for external religious authority. That direct experience of the divine is available to anyone, that the intermediary structures of the institutional church, the priests, the hierarchy, the system of sin and penance and permission are not the path to God. They are, in fact, obstacles to it. In the 14th century, this was not a small claim. This was not a polite theological disagreement. This was, from the perspective of the institutional church, an existential threat. Margaret Perret was arrested by the Inquisition. She was offered her life in exchange for recanting. She refused. In 1310, she was burned at the stake in Paris. Her book burned with her. But here's what the men who burned her couldn't quite manage to accomplish. They couldn't erase what she had written. Copies of The Mirror of Simple Souls survived, circulating anonymously for centuries, read by mystics and philosophers across Europe who had no idea a woman had written it. It wasn't until the 20th century that scholars established Margaret Perret's authorship definitively. Her ideas outlived everyone who tried to destroy them. And Margaret was not alone. The Beguine communities produced, with remarkable consistency, women who thought rigorously and wrote beautifully, and refused to accept that the boundaries of what was permissible to think and say were as fixed as authority figures insisted they were. Mechtilde of Magdeburg wrote mystical visions that mixed spiritual insight with sharp social criticism, describing heavenly courts and earthly corruption with equal vividness. Hildegard of Antwerp wrote poetry, actual lyric poetry, sophisticated and technically accomplished, exploring the nature of love and longing, and the relationship between the human and the divine. Beatrice of Nazareth produced theological prose of such clarity and depth that it influenced the great male mystics who came after her, most of whom never credited their source. These were not naive or uneducated women stumbling into big ideas. These were rigorous, learned, deliberate thinkers who had been given, by the structure of their communities, what most medieval women never received: time, space, colleagues who took their thinking seriously, libraries, the freedom to follow an idea wherever it led, without someone arriving, to redirect their attention to more appropriate concerns. Now, the relationship between the Beguines and the institutional church was, predictably, complicated, and it turned, at various points, genuinely dangerous. The Council of Vienne in 1311, the same year, after Margaret Perret's execution, issued a decree that essentially declared the Beguine way of life suspect. Their independence, their theological innovation, their refusal to submit to male ecclesiastical authority, all of it was framed as dangerous deviation. Local bishops were empowered to suppress Beguine communities, confiscate their property, disperse their members. But here's the kicker, and this detail tells you everything about how economically embedded these communities had become. In city after city where local authorities moved to suppress the Beguines, the economic consequences were immediate and severe. The textile industries they had been running for decades collapsed. Supply chains failed. Export revenues dropped. The men who had spent years quietly resenting the Beguine success discovered, to their considerable discomfort, that they actually had no idea how to replace it. In Cologne, where the suppression was attempted most aggressively, the city council reversed course within a few years and restored the Beguines' operating rights. Not out of principle, out of economic necessity. The city needed them more than it resented them. Power, it turns out, has a way of asserting itself even when the people holding it are officially invisible. What strikes me most about the Beguines, the thing I keep returning to, the thing that feels most alive and relevant across 8 centuries, is this: they didn't ask permission. They didn't petition male authorities for the right to organise. They didn't wait for ecclesiastical approval before building their hospitals. They didn't seek validation from the guild system before developing their textile expertise. They identified a need, assembled resources, recruited people, and built something. And then they kept building it for 150 years, across 200 cities, encompassing hundreds of thousands of women, producing economic output that shaped the trade networks of an entire continent. The audacity of it is breathtaking. But the Beguines, extraordinary as they were, represent only one path through the landscape of medieval female independence. Because outside the Beguinages, in the ordinary commercial cities of medieval Europe, another category of woman was discovering that the path to power sometimes came wrapped in grief, and that sometimes losing a husband was the best thing that could happen to a woman's career. The widow's upgrade. There is a moment that appears, again and again, in the historical records of medieval Europe, a moment that must have looked, from the outside, like pure tragedy. A woman receives news of her husband's death. She weeps, perhaps. She makes arrangements. She observes the proper mourning period, wears the proper mourning clothes, receives the condolences of neighbours and guild associates and church officials. And then, quietly, methodically, she gets to work. Because what no one talks about, what the popular image of the grieving medieval widow entirely obscures, is what that moment of loss also represented, legally and economically. For a woman who had spent years subsumed under coverture, who had watched her property transfer into another person's name, who had signed nothing, owned nothing, decided nothing in her own right for however many years the marriage had lasted. The death of a husband, under medieval inheritance law, did not just end a marriage, it ended coverture. It restored, in a single legal moment, everything that marriage had taken away. 2. And the women who understood this, who had been watching, learning, waiting, moved with a speed and competence that tells you, unmistakably, that they had been ready for a long time. Let's talk about the legal mechanics first, because the details matter. Under the inheritance laws operating across most of medieval Europe with variations by region and time period, but a broadly consistent framework, a widow was entitled to claim what was called her dower right. In England, this meant 1/3 of all lands her husband had held during the marriage, guaranteed to her for the remainder of her life. In many continental jurisdictions, the proportion was higher. 1/2 was common, and in some regions and circumstances, a widow could claim the entirety of jointly accumulated marital property. This was not charity. It was not a gift from a benevolent system. It was a legal entitlement, enforceable in court, and medieval widows enforced it, aggressively, successfully. But the dower right was only the beginning, because widowhood didn't just return a woman's property to her, it returned her legal personhood. Her Femme Sole status, or its equivalent in continental legal systems, was automatically restored the moment her husband died. She could sign contracts again, appear in court again, trade in her own name again, make decisions again. For women who had spent years, sometimes decades, legally invisible, this restoration was not abstract. It was immediate, practical, and, in the hands of women who had been paying close attention during their marriages, extraordinarily productive. Picture this. Venice, 1472. A woman named Caterina Corner sits in the throne room of a palace on the island of Cyprus, conducting the business of a kingdom. She is the Queen Regnant of Cyprus, Jerusalem, and Armenia, a title that sounds like a medieval fantasy but was, at this moment, a geopolitical reality with consequences stretching across the eastern Mediterranean. Caterina had married the King of Cyprus, James II, in 1472. He died the following year, leaving her pregnant. Their infant son died shortly after birth. And Caterina, a Venetian noblewoman, 20 years old, alone on an island in the middle of a sea full of competing imperial interests, became, by inheritance, the sole ruler of a strategically critical kingdom. She governed for 15 years. And here's what gets me about Caterina's story. She was good at it. Not good in the hedged, apologetic way that women's historical competence often gets acknowledged, not remarkable for a woman or impressive under the circumstances. Good, full stop. She navigated the Byzantine politics of late 15th century Mediterranean power with skill and pragmatism. She managed Venetian pressure, Ottoman threat, and internal Cypriot factionalism simultaneously, maintaining stability on an island that had every reason to descend into chaos. When Venice finally pressured her into ceding the island in 1489, a decision made not by Caterina's failure, but by Venice's strategic calculation that direct control of Cyprus was worth more than a client queen, she negotiated her exit with the same pragmatism she had brought to her governance. She received, in exchange for her abdication, a substantial Venetian estate, an annual income that made her one of the wealthiest private individuals in Europe, and a title Lady of Asolo that came with genuine local authority. She spent the remaining years of her life in Asolo, running what contemporary accounts describe as one of the most intellectually and culturally vibrant courts in northern Italy. Writers, artists, philosophers, musicians, all gathered around Caterina Corner, a woman who had ruled a kingdom, negotiated her way out of it, and then built herself a third act that suited her perfectly. The historian Benjamin Arbel, whose research on Caterina's reign is the most comprehensive we have, notes that she managed Cyprus with a sophistication that her male predecessors had frequently failed to match. Power, in Caterina's hands, looked like competence. But Caterina Corner was royalty, which means her story, as extraordinary as it is, exists on a register that can feel distant from ordinary life. So let me bring you somewhere more intimate, more immediately human. Florence, 1420s. A woman named Alessandra Strozzi is 30 years old, recently widowed with 5 children, a household to run, and a banking business that her husband left in a state of considerable disorder. What Alessandra did next is documented in unusual detail because she was a prolific letter writer and a substantial portion of her correspondence survives. These letters addressed to her sons, to business partners, to friends across Italy and beyond, give us something rare in medieval women's history, an interior view, not just what she did, but how she thought about it. And what they show is a mind of remarkable acuity operating at full capacity under serious pressure. Alessandra took over the Strozzi banking operations and, within a few years, turned them profitable. Not through luck or favourable conditions. The 1420s and 1430s were economically turbulent in Florence, but through careful analysis, strategic relationship management, and a willingness to make decisions and stand behind them. She expanded into foreign exchange operations across multiple European cities. She managed her son's exile from Florence. They'd been politically exiled along with their father's faction with a combination of financial support and strategic advice that historian Heather Gregory, who has written extensively on the Strozzi correspondence, describes as nothing short of sophisticated political management at a distance. She was running an international business, raising 5 children, navigating factional Florentine politics, and corresponding with business partners from Rome to Bruges, all simultaneously, all from a position of recent grief and sudden sole responsibility. And she didn't just survive it, she built something. The Strozzi family's eventual return to Florence, their restoration to wealth and influence, was built substantially on the foundation Alessandra laid during the decades she ran the family's affairs alone. The famous Strozzi Palace, one of the great Renaissance buildings of Florence, still standing today, was funded in significant part by wealth accumulated and preserved under Alessandra's management. She never remarried. That choice, the choice not to remarry, turns out to be one of the most consistent and revealing patterns in the historical record of medieval widowhood, because it wasn't unusual, it was the norm. Data from Venetian tax records compiled around 1,400 shows that widows controlled approximately 35% of all private wealth in the city. 35%. No, in one of the richest cities in the world, more than a third of private capital was in female hands, and the women holding that wealth were, overwhelmingly, choosing to keep holding it. The reasons are not mysterious, and the historical sources don't leave us guessing. Remarriage, for a wealthy widow, meant coverture again. It meant watching property she had built and managed and grown transfer once more into a husband's legal control. It meant losing the Femme Sole status she had worked so hard, in some cases, had waited years of marriage to regain. For women with substantial assets and demonstrated capacity to manage them, the calculation was straightforward. Remarriage was, economically speaking, a terrible deal. Historian Barbara Hannawalt, whose work on medieval English widows is among the most rigorous in the field, found consistent evidence across the records. She studied that widows of property actively and deliberately avoided remarriage, not because they hated men, not because they were incapable of attraction or attachment, but because they had done the math. And the math was unambiguous. Here's where it gets really interesting, because the influence these women wielded wasn't just economic, it was political, social, and cultural in ways that rippled outward through their entire communities. Joan of Kent, known to history primarily as the mother of Richard II and the wife of Edward the Black Prince, is one of the more remarkable examples of how a well-positioned widow could exercise genuine political influence. In medieval England, after Edward's death in 1376, Joan became, in effect, the most politically connected woman in England. Her relationships, her access, her accumulated social capital from decades at the centre of English court life were formidable. Contemporary accounts and Joan appears in numerous chroniclers' records, which itself tells you something about her visibility, consistently describe her as an active participant in the political negotiations of the late 1370s and 1380s. During the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when the situation in London became genuinely dangerous, Joan acted as an intermediary, using her relationships and her credibility to navigate between the rebels and the crown, with a pragmatism that likely prevented further violence. The chronicler Jean Froissart, not generally given to effusive praise of women's political capabilities, described her intervention in terms that amount to acknowledgement of genuine statesmanship. She was a widow. Officially, in the language of the medieval court, she held no formal political role, but power, as the historical record of medieval widowhood shows us again and again, does not wait politely for a formal title. And then there were the women who used their wealth not just to accumulate more wealth, but to build things that outlasted them. Hospitals, schools, almshouses, foundations for the support of poor women, specifically poor women that functioned as what we would today call charitable endowments. This is not incidental, this is not footnote material. The degree to which medieval charitable infrastructure, the hospitals, the schools, the poverty relief systems that kept urban populations from complete destitution was funded by wealthy widows is genuinely extraordinary. In city after city, the major charitable foundations of the 14th and 15th centuries trace their funding back to women who had accumulated wealth under their own management and then directed it, deliberately and strategically, toward the communities and causes they cared about. They were not just holding wealth, they were deploying it, shaping their cities, building institutions, creating, in some cases, what amounted to alternative social safety nets specifically designed to support other women who lacked their resources. What strikes me about this pattern is the self-awareness it implies. These women knew they had been lucky in inheritance, lucky in the competence to manage what they received, lucky to live long enough to deploy it. And many of them responded to that luck by trying to reduce how much luck other women needed. But I want to come back to something personal, something quieter than kingdoms and banking empires and political negotiations, because not every medieval widow was Caterina Corner or Alessandra Strozzi. Most of them were ordinary women in ordinary cities, managing ordinary lives, a small holding, a craft workshop, a modest trading operation who had simply been given, by the accident of widowhood, the right to run their own lives, and the records suggest that many of these women found something in that experience that they had not expected, something they had perhaps been told was not available to them, or not appropriate for them, or simply not compatible with a properly feminine life. They found that they were capable, that the decisions they made were good ones, that the businesses they ran stayed solvent, that the households they managed functioned, that the lives they lived, on their own terms, were full and meaningful and satisfying in ways that surprised them. The historical record is not given to emotional vocabulary. Medieval administrative documents do not typically record how people felt. But here and there, in letters and in legal testimony, and in the occasional memoir-like document that survives from this period, you find women saying, in various ways, the same thing. I did not know I could do this, and now that I know, I will not give it up. But not every path to medieval female independence ran through marriage and its ending, because there was a group of women who found power through an entirely different door, one that required neither husband nor his death, but instead the deliberate, systematic construction of something new out of pure ambition and extraordinary nerve. The self-made women, the entrepreneurs, the ones who started with nothing and built something that, in some cases, changed the commercial landscape of an entire region. Their stories are waiting, and they are going to absolutely blow your mind. Self-made, medieval women who built empires. Let me tell you about a woman who could not read. Not because she lacked intelligence, everything we know about her suggests the opposite. Not because she lacked opportunity in any simple sense. She was born into a reasonably comfortable family in the English town of Lynn, in Norfolk, sometime around 1373. But literacy, for women of her class and time, was not a given. It was not expected. It was, in many circles, actively discouraged. Her name was Margery Kempe, and by the time she was 40 years old, she had built one of the most diversified small business operations in the east of England, employed somewhere in the region of 300 people across multiple industries, travelled independently across Europe and the Middle East, and dictated because she still could not write one of the most remarkable autobiographical documents to survive from the entire medieval period. She started with a brewery that failed. Picture this: Lynn, Norfolk, around 1394. Margery is in her early 20s, recently married to a man named John Kempe, and she has decided to go into business. The brewing trade in late medieval England was a substantial commercial operation. Ale was the primary safe drinking liquid for most of the population, water being too often contaminated to trust, and the demand was constant and significant. Margery saw an opportunity, invested and launched, and then everything went wrong. The ale wouldn't ferment correctly. Batch after batch failed. Her workers, she records, lost confidence in her operation. The business hemorrhaged money. By any conventional measure, it was a disaster. Here's where most people in most eras would have retreated, accepted the failure as a verdict, concluded that business was not for them, and found some other accommodation with life. Margery Kempe moved on to horse milling. And then, when that also ran into difficulties, she moved on to something else, and then something else after that. And here's the thing, here's what the historical record actually shows. When you trace her through the documents that survive, she kept going until she found what worked, and then she scaled it. By her middle years, Margery was running operations that spanned cloth trading, money lending at small scales, and various forms of commercial agency, essentially acting as a broker and facilitator for other merchants. Leveraging her network of relationships and her evident talent for negotiation into a business model that didn't require her to produce anything physical at all. It required her to know people, to understand what they needed, to put the right parties together and take a margin in the middle. She was, in modern language, running a services business in 14th century Norfolk. But Margery Kempe's story, as wonderful as it is, represents only one version of medieval female entrepreneurship. Because across the Channel, in the wool towns of the Cotswolds and the trading networks of the English export economy, a different kind of businesswoman was doing something that had even longer-lasting consequences. Her name was Rose of Burford, and she changed the way international wool trade worked. Wool was, to medieval England, roughly what finance is to modern London. The industry, everything else depended on. The source of the country's international prestige and economic leverage, the commodity that filled royal coffers and funded wars. The quality of English wool, particularly the fine fleeces from the Cotswolds and the Welsh marches, was renowned across Europe. Italian merchants paid premium prices for it. Flemish weavers considered it irreplaceable. But quality control was, in the early 14th century, a significant problem. There was no standardized system for certifying that a shipment of wool actually met the specifications a foreign buyer had paid for. Fraud was common. Disputes were endless. The transaction costs of international wool trade, in time, in legal fees, in damaged business relationships, were enormous. Rose of Burford solved this problem. Working from her base in the Cotswolds sometime in the early 14th century, Rose developed what amounts to the first systematic international quality certification system for English wool exports. She created standardized grading criteria. She built inspection processes. She established her personal reputation as a guarantor, a merchant whose assessment of a wool clip's quality was reliable enough that foreign buyers would pay a premium simply because Rose had certified it. She was, in effect, creating a brand, not a product brand, but something more sophisticated, a certification brand, a quality mark, a guarantee backed not by institutional authority, but by the accumulated trust of years of honest dealing. Historian Eileen Power, whose foundational research on medieval English wool trade remains essential reading in the field, identified Rose of Burford as one of the key figures in the professionalisation of English wool exports. Her system, her instinct that trust, reliably delivered, could be monetised was genuinely innovative. It anticipated, by several centuries, the kind of quality certification infrastructure that would become standard in international trade. Rose didn't invent it because she had studied economics. She invented it because she had a problem to solve and the intelligence to solve it creatively. And then there is Christine de Pizan, who is, in some ways, the most modern of all the medieval women we're meeting tonight. Christine was born in Venice in 1364, the daughter of a physician and astrologer who had been appointed to the court of the French king Charles V. She grew up in Paris, in an intellectually stimulating environment, educated to a standard unusual for women of the time. She married young and happily by her own account. The marriage was genuinely good, a partnership she valued. And then, in 1390, her husband died. She was 25 years old with 3 children, an elderly mother, and a niece to support. No income, significant debts, and no obvious path forward. What Christine did next is one of the most deliberate and successful career pivots in the history of European letters. She decided to become a professional writer. Not a writer in the sense of someone who occasionally produced texts for private circulation, a professional. Someone who wrote for money, who cultivated patrons, who understood that intellectual production was a market with buyers and sellers, and that she could compete in it. She developed, over the following decades, what can only be described as a multimedia content strategy. She wrote poetry lyric verse of considerable technical accomplishment that found ready patrons among the French and English nobility. She wrote political theory analyses of governance and statecraft that were read by kings and their advisors. She wrote history, a biography of Charles V that remains a valuable historical source. She wrote philosophy. She wrote allegory. She wrote, eventually, the Book of the City of Ladies, a systematic, argued, evidence-based refutation of the misogynist literature that dominated educated discourse in her time. A book that built its case brick by brick, woman by woman, achievement by achievement, and that stands today as arguably the first work of sustained feminist argument in Western literature. And she managed all of this while running what was effectively a small publishing operation, supervising the production of manuscript copies of her work, maintaining quality control over the texts, managing relationships with the scriptoria that produced them, and negotiating her own fees and terms with patrons across France, England, and Italy. She employed assistants. She maintained a professional correspondence network. She understood her market, knew her audience, and priced her work accordingly. Historian Charity Cannon Willard, whose comprehensive biography of Christine remains the standard scholarly account, describes her operation as unprecedented not just for a woman, but for any writer of the period. Christine had turned literary production into a business, and she ran it with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything else. She was, without question, Europe's first professional female author. She was also, in a very real sense, one of its first literary entrepreneurs. Now here's what I find absolutely fascinating about all 3 of these women, Margery, Rose, Christine, and about the dozens of other female entrepreneurs whose stories survive in medieval records. They all faced the same fundamental problem, and they all solved it the same way. The problem was this: the formal commercial infrastructure of medieval Europe, the guild system, the merchant networks, the credit markets. The legal machinery of contract enforcement was built for men, not exclusively, not always consciously, but structurally. The default assumption was male. The relationships that lubricated business, the informal networks through which information and credit and opportunity flowed, operated primarily through male homosocial bonds. Men doing business with men they had known since apprenticeship, men extending credit to men whose families they knew, men vouching for men in court. A woman entering this system was an outsider by default. She lacked the relationship capital that men accumulated through years of guild membership and apprenticeship. She faced skepticism about her reliability, her permanence, her authority to make binding commitments. She often faced outright exclusion guild rules that barred female membership, credit markets that refused to extend terms to female traders, courts that questioned her standing. And the solution these women converged on, independently, across different cities and different trades in different decades, was the same. They built parallel infrastructure. In London, a network that contemporaries called, informally, the Sisterhood of Trade. Not an official institution, but a dense web of relationships among female merchants who shared market intelligence, extended credit to each other when the formal credit markets excluded them, provided character references in court proceedings, and coordinated on pricing and supply in ways that gave them collective leverage they couldn't achieve individually. In Paris, by the early 14th century, women were running more than 100 separate guilds, not as anomalies, not as occasional exceptions, but as a structural feature of the Parisian craft economy. Silkworking, in particular, was dominated by female guildmasters whose control of the trade was so complete that male merchants entering the Parisian silk market had to work through female networks to access it, not the other way around. In Cologne, and this data point is one of my absolute favourites, women controlled approximately 78% of beer production. 78%. Of one of the most economically significant commodity trades in a major medieval city, the women who brewed Cologne's beer were not peripheral figures in its economy. They were central to it. And in York, consistent with the pattern we've already seen, women held approximately 23% of commercial real estate in the city centre prime trading locations, hard-won and carefully maintained. Here's what the data points, taken together, are actually telling us. In sector after sector, city after city, decade after decade of the medieval period, women who operated independently, whether through Femme Sole status, through widowhood, through collective organisation, or through sheer entrepreneurial force of will, demonstrated that they were not just capable of competing in commercial markets, they were capable of dominating specific segments of them. The 78% beer production figure in Cologne is not a rounding error. The 100-plus female guildmasters in Paris are not statistical noise. The 23% of London and York commercial property in female hands is not an anomaly. These are patterns. Consistent, repeated, geographically widespread patterns that tell us something important about the relationship between female capability and opportunity. Given the opportunity, women competed. Given the structures to support them, they thrived. Given the legal recognition, they built things. What prevented universal female commercial participation in medieval Europe was not inability, it was architecture. The architecture of systems designed around male default assumptions and the willingness of those systems to enforce their own exclusions when women found ways around them. But here's what I find most remarkable and most moving about the medieval female entrepreneurs we've met tonight. They knew the game was rigged. They knew the system was built against them. They had no illusions about the skepticism they faced, the additional credibility burdens they carried, the informal exclusions that cost them time and opportunity and money every single day. And they built anyway. Not naively, not by ignoring the obstacles, but by being, consistently and deliberately, better than the system required. By being more reliable, more precise, more innovative, more persistent than their male competitors needed to be. By building networks that substituted for the networks they were excluded from. By developing skills quality certification, brand building, cooperative financing, relationship management that turned their exclusion from male infrastructure into an incentive to create something better. Christine de Pizan did not succeed despite operating outside the male literary establishment. She succeeded in part because operating outside it forced her to understand the market in ways that insiders never needed to. Rose of Burford did not develop her quality certification system because she had access to the formal trade institutions that might have solved the problem through official channels. She developed it because she was excluded from those institutions and had to solve the problem herself. Margery Kempe did not build a diversified service business because she had a business education. She built it because repeated failure forced her to develop a more sophisticated understanding of what she was actually good at. Constraints, it turns out, can be generative. Exclusion can produce innovation. The people forced to solve problems the system won't solve for them sometimes end up solving them better than the system ever could. But I need to tell you what happened next, because everything we've been building toward the legal frameworks, the Beguine communities, the widows' empires, the female entrepreneurs, all of it existed in a context that was slowly, then rapidly, turning hostile. The success of independent medieval women was real. It was documented, it was economically significant, and it was, ultimately, threatening. Not to everyone, not all at once, not through any single coordinated decision, but to enough people, with enough power, over enough time. And the response, when it came, was not subtle, it was not gentle, it was not limited to legal reform or economic competition or polite social pressure. It was fire, and language, and medicine, and 300 years of systematically turning the memory of everything we've talked about tonight into something shameful. The burning season is coming, and it will make everything we've discussed so far look very different indeed. The burning season. How success became a death sentence. I want to be very careful with this chapter, because what we're about to discuss is genuinely dark. It involves real suffering, real deaths, real systemic violence, directed at real people over the course of 3 centuries. And I think the only honest way to approach it is to resist the temptation to make it feel distant or abstract, to keep it human, to keep it specific, to keep the focus on what was actually happening and why. Because the why is what matters most. The why is what turns this from a catalogue of historical horrors into something that illuminates how the world actually works, how power actually defends itself, how the erasure of inconvenient history actually gets accomplished. And the why, when you look at it clearly, is not mysterious at all. It is in fact deeply rational, coldly, systematically, terrifyingly rational. What happened to independent women in late medieval and early modern Europe was not mass hysteria. It was not irrational superstition running out of control. It was not the unfortunate byproduct of ignorance. It was a strategy. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers matter. Between approximately 1,450 and 1,750, 300 years, spanning the transition from medieval to early modern Europe, somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people were tried and executed for witchcraft across the European continent and its colonial extensions. Historians debate the precise figure, but the range is consistent across the major scholarly accounts. 80 to 85% of those executed were women. Let that proportion settle for a moment. In a persecution that lasted 3 centuries, that touched every country in Europe, that was conducted by both Catholic and Protestant authorities with equal enthusiasm, the overwhelming majority of victims, 4 out of every 5 were female. This was not random. Statistical distributions this skewed are never random. They reflect targeting. They reflect a profile, a set of characteristics that made certain individuals vulnerable to accusation, to prosecution, to conviction, to death. And when you look at what that profile actually was when you examine, as historian Robin Briggs at Oxford did in his comprehensive study of European witch trials, the actual characteristics of the women most frequently accused a pattern emerges that is impossible to misread. The women most likely to be accused of witchcraft in late medieval and early modern Europe were, disproportionately, unmarried, older, living alone, economically independent, socially prominent in their communities, owners of property, practitioners of trades. A single woman living alone and running a successful business was, according to the statistical analysis of trial records, approximately 12 times more likely to face a witchcraft accusation than a married woman of similar age and social standing. 12 times. Picture this. A small town in the German-speaking lands. Sometime in the late 15th century, 2 women live on the same street. Both are in their 40s. Both are respected in the community, known faces, established presences, people whose names appear in local records. The first woman is married. Her husband is a craftsman of modest means. She helps in the workshop, manages the household, raises children. Her legal existence is subsumed into her husband's. She owns nothing in her own name. She decides nothing without his agreement. She is, in the formal language of the law, covered. The second woman is unmarried. She runs a textile workshop she built herself over 20 years. She employs 8 workers. She owns the building she works in and the house she lives in. She has credit relationships with wool merchants in 2 neighbouring cities. She appears in court records not as a defendant, but as a plaintiff, a witness, a party to contracts. She is legally visible, economically significant, socially present in ways the married woman, for all her competence and intelligence, simply is not. Now a bad harvest comes. Livestock die. A child falls ill. The community looks for an explanation, because communities under stress always look for an explanation. The question of who gets accused is framed, officially, in theological language: who has made a pact with the devil, who is practicing maleficium, who is the source of the community's misfortune. But the answer, in case after case in the historical record, tracks with something much more mundane than theology. It tracks with visibility, it tracks with property, it tracks with independence. It tracks with the question of who, in the community, has things worth taking and limited institutional protection against having them taken. The unmarried woman with the textile workshop is 12 times more likely to end up in front of an inquisitor than her married neighbour. Here's the kicker. And this is the part that I find most chilling, because it is so deliberate, so calculated, so far removed from anything we could call spontaneous. When accused women were convicted and executed for witchcraft, their property was confiscated, not as a side effect, not as an incidental consequence, as a standard, codified feature of the legal process. Property confiscation was built into the machinery of witch prosecution from the beginning. In many jurisdictions, the costs of the trial itself, the inquisitor's fees, the torturer's fees, the cost of the wood for the execution were billed to the accused's estate before any remainder was distributed, which meant that an accusation, regardless of its outcome, was financially destructive to the accused. And a conviction was financially catastrophic, total liquidation of everything a woman had built over a lifetime, transferred into the hands of the prosecuting authority, the local lord, or the accusers themselves, depending on the jurisdiction's specific arrangements. Historian Silvia Federici, in her landmark study Caliban and the Witch, argues that the witch trials cannot be understood apart from this economic dimension. She is not alone in this argument. It has become, over the past several decades, one of the more robust conclusions in the historical scholarship on the trials. The prosecution of witches, at the institutional level, was profitable. It was a mechanism for property transfer from independent women to male-controlled institutions. And it was, she argues, specifically targeted at women who represented a model of female economic autonomy that was, by the late 15th century, being identified as a problem requiring solution. Whether or not one accepts every element of Federici's argument, and some historians find aspects of it overstated, the core empirical observation is difficult to dispute. The people most likely to be accused were disproportionately propertied, independent women. Their property transferred upon conviction, and the persecution lasted, at scale, for exactly the period during which female economic independence was being most aggressively curtailed across European commercial society. These are not coincidences, but the fire was only one instrument of the erasure. And in some ways, hear me out on this, it was not the most effective one. Because fire is visible, fire is dramatic, fire produces martyrs, fire creates the possibility of memory, of record, of eventual historical recovery. You can, centuries later, find the trial records. You can reconstruct what happened. You can, as historians have done, restore some measure of dignity and specificity to the women who died. Language is harder to fight than fire. And the people who wanted to erase the model of the independent medieval woman understood, whether consciously or instinctively, that controlling the words was more powerful than controlling the bodies. Let me tell you about a word: spinster. In its original medieval usage, and I mean this quite precisely, this is documented linguistic history, not speculation. Spinster was a job title. A neutral, functional, entirely respectable occupational descriptor. A spinster was a woman who spun thread. Spinning was a skilled trade. It was economically significant. It was one of the foundational occupations of the textile industry that, as we've seen, independent women had built into one of the most powerful economic sectors in medieval Europe. To be a spinster was to be a skilled worker in a respected industry. The word carried connotations of competence, of productivity, of economic contribution. It was, in the world of medieval guildcraft, an honourable designation. Sometime between the late medieval period and the 18th century, the word underwent a transformation so complete that its original meaning became almost entirely invisible. Spinster ceased to mean a woman who spins thread. It came to mean an unmarried older woman specifically, an unmarried older woman understood as having failed at the primary female project of securing a husband. Pitiable, comic, slightly ridiculous, certainly not threatening. The economic competence that the word originally referenced, the skill, the independence, the commercial significance, was not just forgotten. It was inverted. What had been a mark of productive capability became a mark of social failure. This was not accidental linguistic drift. Words don't transform this completely, this consistently, this conveniently, by accident. Compare it to bachelor. Bachelor, throughout the same period, underwent no such transformation. A bachelor was an unmarried man. He remained, through the medieval period and into the modern era, a figure of possibility, young, available, full of potential, making choices rather than suffering failures. Bachelor carried, and largely still carries, no connotation of inadequacy, no suggestion of pitiable incompleteness, no implication that something had gone wrong. Same social status, unmarried adult, two completely different words, two completely different valuations. Historian Amy Freud at the University of Maryland has documented this linguistic divergence in meticulous detail. Her work on the history of the word spinster traces exactly how, and approximately when, the transformation occurred, and she is quite clear that it was not a neutral process. The degradation of spinster from honourable occupational term to social insult was part of a broader cultural project of devaluing female independence, specifically economic female independence, specifically at the moment when that independence was most threatening to existing power arrangements. Language, weaponized, turns competence into deficiency, turns choice into failure, turns strength into something to be pitied or mocked. And once the language shifts, the history that preceded it becomes harder to see. If spinster means failed woman, then the women who are called spinsters, the skilled, independent, commercially successful textile workers of medieval Europe, become invisible behind the word that was designed to obscure them. And then, and here's where it gets almost darkly comedic, if the consequences weren't so serious, medicine got involved. Because if legal violence and linguistic transformation weren't quite sufficient to fully pathologize female independence, there was always the option of inventing diseases. I mean that quite literally. The late medieval and early modern medical establishment, such as it was, a body of theory derived largely from misreading classical sources and elaborating them in directions that happened to be socially convenient, produced, over the course of the 15th and 16th centuries, a remarkable array of medical conditions affecting women, conditions with elaborate Latin names, theoretical explanations, and prescribed treatments. Conditions that, when you examine their symptom profiles, turn out to describe, with remarkable consistency, women who were healthy, capable, and independent. The condition called furor uterinus, uterine fury, was said to afflict women who were experiencing irrational agitation. The symptoms that supposedly indicated it included being argumentative, being intellectually active, preferring solitude, being dissatisfied with domestic arrangements, and showing resistance to male authority. The condition called chlorosis, or green sickness, was attributed specifically to unmarried young women. Its supposed symptoms included excessive intellectual activity, preference for solitude and reading, lack of interest in marriage, and what the medical literature described as unnatural contentment with an unmarried state. The condition called furor virginia's virgin madness was said to afflict young unmarried women specifically. Its symptoms included financial acuity, meaning skill with numbers and accounts, preference for commerce over domesticity, contentment with unmarried life, and what the text described as inappropriate confidence in one's own judgment. Read those symptom profiles again. Being good at math, preferring books, living alone contentedly, being skilled at business, being confident in one's own decisions. These were the symptoms of a disease requiring medical treatment. The prescribed treatments were, with grim consistency, the same: marriage, male supervision, reduction of intellectual activity, and in more extreme cases, bloodletting and dietary restriction designed to reduce the patient's energy and initiative. Historian Helen King at the Open University has done extraordinary work documenting the history of these invented conditions. She is quite clear in her analysis. The diseases were constructed. The symptom profiles were assembled from observations of real women, independent, healthy, competent women, and then labelled pathological. The medical language gave institutional legitimacy to what was, at its core, a social project. The definition of female independence as illness, and the prescription of male authority as cure. What were the consequences of all this? The fire, the language, the medicine, the 3-century project of erasing and pathologizing and criminalizing the model of the independent woman. The consequences were real, measurable, lasting. The female guild masters who had run more than 100 Parisian guilds in the early 14th century had, by the late 16th century, been systematically excluded from most of them. The Beguines communities that had covered northern Europe with hundreds of thousands of women in self-governing communes had been suppressed, dispersed, reduced to small remnants. The Femme Sole legal designation, while not entirely eliminated, was increasingly undermined by legal interpretations that restricted its scope and complicated its application. The proportion of women in commercial trades dropped sharply across the 15th and 16th centuries, in city after city, across England and France and the German states. The economic infrastructure that independent women had built, the female guilds, the commercial networks, the cooperative financing arrangements, was dismantled, absorbed into male-controlled institutions, or simply allowed to wither as the women who had sustained it were excluded, prosecuted, or frightened into compliance. And the memory, the collective cultural memory of what had existed, of what women had built, of what female independence had looked like in its functioning, productive, socially embedded reality was buried under layers of language and medicine and official history that replaced it with something else entirely. The old maid, the spinster, the hysterical woman, the witch, figures of contempt, not of inspiration, warnings, not models. But here is what I want you to hold on to as we move through the darkness of this chapter toward the light on the other side. The erasure was not complete. It could not be complete, because the evidence was too widely distributed, too deeply embedded in too many records, in too many cities and too many archives. The guild records survived. The court documents survived. The letters survived. The property registries survived. The administrative accounts survived. The women were buried, but they were not gone. And while the mainstream culture was busy constructing its story of the pitiable spinster and the hysterical independent woman, other women in convents, in the remnant Beguine communities, in the quiet corners of commercial life, that the suppression never fully reached, were keeping something alive. Something stubborn, something quiet, something that refused, regardless of what the law said or what the medical texts claimed or what the preachers declared, to accept that independence was pathology and submission was health. Something that was, in the great abbeys and convents of medieval Europe, being built into institutional form by women of extraordinary ability and absolutely ferocious will. Something we need to talk about before tonight is done. The Abbess and the architect. There is a letter written sometime around 1170 from a woman in the Rhine Valley of what is now Germany to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, one of the most powerful rulers in the medieval world. A man whose political and military reach extended across Central Europe, whose authority was backed by armies and the weight of imperial tradition, whose favour was courted by kings and popes. The letter is not deferential. It is not hedged with the apologetic qualifications that might be expected from a woman writing to an emperor in the 12th century. It is direct. It is confident. No. It carries the tone of someone who considers herself, if not the emperor's equal, then certainly not his supplicant. It addresses matters of political theology, of governance, of the moral responsibilities of power. It offers, with considerable specificity, the writer's assessment of where Frederick's policies have gone wrong and what he ought to do about it. Frederick Barbarossa read this letter, he responded. He took the advice seriously. The woman who wrote it was Hildegard of Bingen. She was an abbess. She ran a convent. She had no army, no territory, no formal political authority of any kind, and she corresponded with emperors as a peer. This is the paradox at the heart of the medieval convent, and understanding it requires setting aside almost everything popular culture has told us about what a medieval nun actually was. Let's start with what a convent was not. A convent was not a refuge for women who had failed at life. It was not a warehouse for inconvenient daughters, a dumping ground for women nobody wanted to marry, a place where the unfortunate or the unattractive were sent to live out diminished lives behind walls. That image, the convent as consolation prize, as second best option, as institution of last resort, is a much later construction, largely a product of the Reformation period and its particular hostility to monastic institutions. In the High Medieval period, the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, the major convents of Europe were something entirely different. They were, depending on how you look at them, universities, hospitals, banks, centres of artistic production, political embassies, and sovereign institutions all at once. They were places where women of intelligence and ambition could pursue careers of genuine consequence, accumulate real authority, and exercise power that, in the right circumstances, rivaled that of secular rulers. The woman who ran one of these institutions, the Abbess, held a position that was, in the medieval hierarchy of power, genuinely significant. Not symbolically, not by courtesy. Genuinely, practically, consequentially significant. An abbess in a major house could hold what was called the power of jurisdiction, the right to govern, to discipline, to make binding legal decisions affecting everyone under her authority. Some abbesses held the right of low justice essentially, a magistrate's authority over civil matters within their domain. A small number held rights that went further still, the right to coin money, to raise and maintain armed forces, to conduct diplomatic negotiations with secular rulers, to receive oaths of fealty from knights and vassals. These were not ceremonial powers, they were functional ones, exercised in the real world, with real consequences. But let me bring this down from the institutional to the personal, because the most extraordinary thing about the great medieval abbesses is not the powers they held in the abstract. It is what specific women did with those powers, in specific moments, with the specific intelligence and vision they brought to their roles. And nobody exemplifies this more completely, more astonishingly, than Hildegard of Bingen. Picture this: the Rhineland, Germany, 1098. A child is born, the 10th child of a minor noble family, and is in the custom of the time for 10th children of families who could afford it offered to the church as a tithe, a human tithe. She is sent to live in a small religious community under the guidance of a woman named Jutta of Sponheim. She is, at this point, a child, unremarkable in the eyes of everyone around her. One more girl, in one more small community, in one more corner of medieval Europe. Her name is Hildegard. By the time she dies, 81 years later, she will have composed an entire corpus of liturgical music, 77 musical compositions, more than any other medieval composer of either sex whose work has survived. And music of such structural originality that modern musicologists still argue about what theoretical framework to use to analyze it. She will have written 2 major works of natural science and medicine, documenting hundreds of plants and minerals and animals and their medicinal properties in a systematic way that anticipates the encyclopedic tradition by several centuries. She will have written theological works, visionary texts, describing her spiritual experiences in language of extraordinary power and beauty, that were formally approved by Pope Eugenius III and that circulated across Europe in multiple manuscript copies. She will have written a morality play, the earliest surviving example of the form. She will have invented an alternative alphabet. She will have founded 2 separate monastic institutions. She will have conducted 4 preaching tours across the Rhineland and beyond, speaking publicly to mixed audiences of clergy and laity, something women were formally prohibited from doing, except that Hildegard did it anyway because her authority was sufficient to make the prohibition irrelevant in her case. And she will have maintained correspondence with 4 popes, 2 emperors, dozens of kings and queens and archbishops and abbots, offering advice, delivering verdicts, issuing what amount to prophetic rebukes to the powerful and the corrupt, with a directness that her contemporaries found either terrifying or clarifying, depending on whether they were the ones being rebuked. Let me be direct about what Hildegard of Bingen actually was, in terms that cut through the medieval framing. She was a scientist, a composer, a theologian, a political advisor, a medical researcher, a linguist, a playwright, and an institutional leader, all simultaneously across an 8-decade career. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most accomplished human beings of the 12th century, of either sex, in any field. Here's what really keeps me awake at night about Hildegard's story. Here's what I find both inspiring and quietly devastating about it. The convent made her possible, not the convent as consolation or containment, the convent as institution, as structure, as a framework that provided what Hildegard, and women like her needed to do the work they were capable of doing. The convent gave her time, it gave her a library, it gave her collaborators, other educated women who could engage seriously with her ideas, push back on them, help develop them. It gave her institutional authority that secular society would never have extended to a woman. It gave her a platform, the formal position of abbess from which her voice carried weight, that the voice of a woman in any other position would not have carried. Without the convent, Hildegard von Bingen would have been married young, her considerable intelligence directed toward managing a household and raising children, her scientific curiosity having no outlet, her musical gifts having no institutional support, her political instincts having no arena in which to operate. With the convent, she became Hildegard of Bingen, one of the most significant figures of medieval Europe. The institution was the enabling condition, and the women who understood this, who grasped that the convent, for all its constraints and contradictions, was the one space in medieval society where female intelligence could be fully deployed, used it with a strategic clarity that is, frankly, breathtaking. But Hildegard, extraordinary as she was not alone in this. The medieval period produced, from its convents and abbeys, a remarkable constellation of women whose institutional positions gave them the platform to do things that would otherwise have been impossible. Consider the economic dimension alone. The major convents of medieval Europe were not small operations running on faith and donations. They were substantial economic enterprises, managing land holdings that, in many cases, exceeded those of neighbouring secular lords. They operated mills, breweries, fish ponds, vineyards. They ran hospitals and schools that served the wider community and charged fees for those services. They maintained flocks and herds. They managed tenant farmers across multiple estates. They produced and traded agricultural commodities at commercial scale, and all of this was managed by women. The abbess of a major house was, functionally, a medieval CEO overseeing a complex organisation, managing multiple revenue streams, making capital allocation decisions, negotiating with external parties, supervising a substantial workforce, and ensuring the long-term institutional sustainability of an enterprise that might have been operating continuously for hundreds of years. The skills required for this were not spiritual, they were managerial, financial, diplomatic, and strategic. And the women who did it well, who ran their institutions with the combination of long-term vision and daily operational competence that great institutional management requires, demonstrated, generation after generation, that those skills were in abundant supply. The medical operations run by major convents deserve particular attention, because they were, by the standards of their time, genuinely impressive. Hildegard's two works on natural science and medicine, Physica and Causae et Curae, are not mystical texts dressed in scientific language. They are systematic attempts to document and organize knowledge about the natural world and its relationship to human health. They describe hundreds of plants with medicinal properties, categorize ailments and their treatments, discuss dietary influences on health, and develop a theoretical framework for understanding how the body works that, while rooted in the humoral tradition of classical medicine, extends and modifies that tradition in ways that reflect direct observation rather than purely textual authority. The hospitals that major convents operated run according to frameworks like Hildegard's, staffed by trained women who had studied these materials in the convent's educational programs, had survival rates that contemporary secular medical institutions could not match. Historian Monica Green at Arizona State University, whose work on medieval women's medicine is definitive in the field, has documented the striking gap between outcomes in convent hospitals and outcomes in secular medical institutions of the same period. The convent hospitals were cleaner, better organised, and operated according to more systematic treatment protocols. They achieved better results, and they were run by women. Now, I want to be honest about the limits of this picture, because the convent as institution was not without its contradictions and its costs. Entry into a major convent, for most of the medieval period, required a substantial entry fee, the doz, or dowry, paid to the institution. This meant that the benefits of convent life were, largely, benefits available to women of property. Poor women did not, in general, have access to the educational and professional opportunities that the great abbeys provided. The institution that empowered Hildegard of Bingen was, simultaneously, an institution that required significant family wealth to enter. And the authority that abbesses exercised, real as it was was always exercised within a framework of ecclesiastical oversight that could, and sometimes did, constrain or override their decisions. The most powerful abbess in medieval Europe was still formally subordinate to her bishop, and while many abbesses navigated this subordination with the same strategic intelligence they brought to everything else, cultivating relationships with sympathetic bishops, appealing directly to Rome over the heads of hostile local clergy, leveraging their community's economic importance as a check on ecclesiastical interference, it was a real constraint, not an imaginary one. The convent was not a feminist utopia. It was a complex institution operating within a complex world, offering real but unequally distributed opportunities within real but negotiable constraints. But here's what strikes me about that complexity. The women who worked within it didn't wait for it to become perfect before they used it. They took the space that was available and they expanded it. They took the authority that was formally granted and they extended it into territories that the formal grant had never anticipated. They took the institutional framework and they built, within and around it, something that the framework's designers had not imagined and would not, in many cases, have approved. Hildegard of Bingen was not supposed to preach publicly to mixed audiences. She did it anyway, and her institutional position made it impossible to stop her without creating more political problems than the preaching itself caused. The abbesses who coined money and maintained armies and conducted independent diplomacy were operating at the outer edges of what their formal authority technically permitted. They did it because they could, and because the world needed them to, and because nobody with sufficient power to stop them was motivated to try. And there is something in that pattern, in the combination of formal institutional position and strategic overreach, of granted authority and expanded authority, of working within a system while systematically pushing its boundaries that feels, to me, like a kind of wisdom. Not the wisdom of revolution, not the wisdom that says the system is wrong, let's burn it down and build something new, but the wisdom that says, here is what exists. Here is what it formally permits. And here is how far beyond those formal permissions a sufficiently determined person can actually go, if she is precise enough and strategic enough and patient enough to do it. It is, in many ways, the same wisdom that Margery Kempe showed in building her business from a failed brewery. The same wisdom that Rose of Burford showed in inventing quality certification because she was excluded from the formal institutions that should have solved the problem. The same wisdom that the Beguines showed in constructing an entirely new institutional form because the existing ones didn't serve their needs. Medieval women, in field after field and institution after institution, became experts in the art of doing more with what they had than anyone expected was possible. We are almost at the end of tonight's journey. One more chapter waits, and it is, perhaps, the most quietly powerful of all, because we have spent most of tonight in history, in evidence, in the particular stories of particular women in particular places and times. But history, if it's honest, always curves back toward the present, always asks, what does this mean for us, now, here, in the lives we are actually living? The women we've met tonight knew something about happiness, about independence, about what a life fully and freely lived actually feels like, something that was considered dangerous enough to suppress and erase and pathologize for 300 years. And I think it's time to ask, directly and honestly, whether they were right. The happiness they couldn't explain. There is a document in the archives of the city of Bruges, dating from sometime in the early 14th century, that I keep coming back to. It is not a dramatic document. It is not a political manifesto, or a legal brief, or a theological treatise. It is, in its original form, something closer to an administrative record, an account of the daily life of a Beguine community, compiled by a clerk whose name we don't know, for purposes that were probably mundane and institutional. But embedded in this administrative record, almost incidentally, almost as though the clerk didn't quite know what to do with the observation, is a note about the women he was documenting. He writes, in the careful Latin of a medieval administrator, that the women of this community displayed a quality he found difficult to categorize. They were, he writes, content, not resigned, not enduring, not making the best of difficult circumstances, content in a way that seemed, to him, almost inexplicable given that they were, after all, women living without husbands, without the social validation that marriage was supposed to provide, without the domestic structures that were theoretically the source of female fulfillment. He couldn't explain it. We can. Let's talk about what the historical record actually shows about the emotional and psychological lives of independent medieval women. Because this is where the story becomes not just intellectually interesting, but genuinely, personally relevant. The sources are not perfect. Medieval administrative documents were not designed to capture emotional states. Personal correspondence from this period is rare. Memoir-like texts are rarer still. We are working, as historians always are when dealing with inner lives, with inference and approximation, and the careful reading of what people said and did for evidence of what they felt. But the evidence, taken together, tells a remarkably consistent story. Unmarried women in medieval Europe, women operating independently, managing their own affairs, living by their own decisions, expressed contentment with their lives at a rate that contemporary scholars, working across multiple source types and multiple geographic regions, have estimated to be substantially higher than the rate among married women of comparable social standing. The historian Judith Bennett, at the University of Southern California, whose career has been devoted to recovering the lives of ordinary medieval women, puts the differential at approximately 40%. 40% higher rates of expressed satisfaction, contentment, and what the sources describe as a sense of living fully and purposefully among women who were unmarried and independent compared to women who were married. 40%. This is not a marginal difference. This is not statistical noise. This is a pattern robust enough to survive across different time periods, different geographic regions, different source types, and different social classes. The independent women were happier, and the historical record, for all its limitations and silences, is quite clear about it. But here's what I find most interesting about this finding. It's not just the number, it's what the sources say about why. Because when you read the documents carefully, when you look at the letters and the court testimonies and the occasional memoir-like passage that gives you access to something approaching a medieval woman's actual inner voice, the reasons they give for their contentment are remarkably specific, remarkably coherent, and remarkably familiar. They valued, above almost everything else, the ability to make their own decisions. To wake up in the morning knowing that the choices of the day were theirs to make, that the consequences of those choices would accrue to them, that the work they did was work they had chosen, and that the life they were building was one they had designed. Agnes Sampson, the York textile entrepreneur we met earlier, appears in guild records not just as a commercial entity but occasionally as a person saying something about her own experience. In one document, recorded in the formal language of a legal proceeding but clearly capturing something she actually said, she describes her unmarried state as her great convenience, a phrase that the legal clerk recording it clearly found puzzling, but that reads, across 7 centuries, as the expression of someone who has exactly the life she wants and knows it. Margery Kempe, in the remarkable autobiographical text she dictated, describes the satisfaction she found in her commercial activities with an enthusiasm that is palpable even in translation. She is not describing survival, she is describing engagement. She is describing a woman who is interested in what she is doing, challenged by it, rewarded by it in ways that go beyond the merely financial. Christine de Pizan, whose personal life had been shaped by genuine grief, the loss of a husband she had loved, the sudden responsibility for dependence she hadn't anticipated, wrote about her professional life with a warmth and evident pleasure that is impossible to miss. She describes her writing work as her comfort and her joy. She describes the independence she built through the decades of her career as something she would not trade for anything the conventional feminine life of her time could offer. These are not women performing contentment for an audience. These are women describing their actual experience with the specificity of people who have thought carefully about their own lives and arrived at genuine conclusions. And then there is the health evidence, which is, frankly, startling. The life expectancy data from medieval Europe is incomplete and difficult to work with. Record keeping was inconsistent, cause of death rarely documented, age is often approximate, but the data we have, particularly for the Beguines communities where record keeping was relatively systematic, tells a story that directly contradicts everything the medical establishment of the time was claiming about the dangers of female independence. The Beguines lived long, substantially longer, on the evidence we have, than the average medieval woman of comparable social class. Historians studying the mortality records of major Beguine communities have found consistent evidence of women living into their 70s, 80s, and in some documented cases, their 90s at a time when average life expectancy in medieval Europe hovered somewhere in the mid to late 40s. Now, Some of that difference reflects selection effects. The women who entered Beguine communities tended to be from slightly more prosperous backgrounds, with better baseline nutrition and healthcare access than the poorest urban populations. That's a real confound, and honest scholarship acknowledges it. But it doesn't explain the full gap. Because when you control for social class, when you compare Beguine women to married women of similar economic standing, the longevity advantage persists. The independent women, living in their self-governing communities without the chronic stresses of subordination and legal invisibility and coverture, appear to have been, quite literally, healthier. The medical texts of the 15th and 16th centuries told women that independence was a disease. The mortality data from the communities where independence was actually practiced suggests the opposite was true. Independence, it turns out, was medicine. But I want to talk about something that the happiness data and the health data, as striking as they are, don't fully capture. Something harder to quantify, but perhaps more important than any statistic. I want to talk about friendship. One of the most consistent features of the historical record of independent medieval women across the commercial networks of London and Paris, across the Beguine communities of Northern Europe, across the convents and abbeys of the Rhineland, across the widows' networks of Venice and Florence, is the depth and richness of the friendships these women built with each other. These were not superficial social connections. They were not the polite acquaintanceships of women thrown together by proximity and social obligation. They were, in many cases, relationships of extraordinary intimacy and durability, friendships that lasted decades, that survived geographic separation, that provided emotional sustenance and practical support and intellectual companionship of a quality that the documentary record makes vividly present even across 8 centuries of distance. Hildegard of Bingen's correspondence with the women of her community, her letters to sisters and former students, her expressions of what she called viriditas, the greening life force of love and connection, reveal a woman whose inner life was rich with affection and whose work was sustained, in part, by the depth of her relationships with other women. Christine de Pizan's letters describe friendships with women across France and Italy that were intellectual partnerships as much as personal connections, relationships in which ideas were shared, developed, challenged, and refined through the kind of sustained mutual engagement that most medieval women, absorbed in domestic obligations, never had the time or freedom to maintain. The Beguine communities, with their shared living and shared working and shared intellectual and spiritual life, produced, by their very structure, the conditions for deep friendship. Women who lived together, worked together, managed together, mourned together, and celebrated together over years and decades, built relationships of a solidity and richness that isolated domestic life, however comfortable, could rarely match. This is not incidental. The research of social psychologist Bella De Paulo at the University of California, Santa Barbara, whose work on single life is among the most rigorous in the contemporary field, consistently shows that people who are single, and particularly women who are single, tend to maintain broader, deeper, and more actively tended social networks than their married counterparts. The investment of time and attention that marriage, particularly traditional marriage, directs toward a single dyadic relationship gets distributed among single people across a wider social world. The medieval independent women knew this, in practice if not in theory. Their social worlds were large, their friendships were deep, their communities were real. And those communities did something that went beyond emotional sustenance. They functioned, in the most practical and consequential sense, as infrastructure. Let me tell you about the networks, because the networks are what kept the whole thing alive. Across the trading cities of medieval Europe, independent women had built largely invisibly, largely informally, largely without the institutional recognition that would have made them visible to official history, a set of mutual aid structures that were, in their functional sophistication, genuinely remarkable. The structure was simple in concept and complex in execution. Women who had achieved commercial success and legal standing used those resources to support women who had not yet achieved them. Credit was extended not through formal banking channels, which were largely hostile to female borrowers, but through personal relationship networks, on terms that reflected trust rather than collateral. Information was shared market intelligence, legal advice, knowledge of which court officials were sympathetic and which were hostile, intelligence about which trading partners were reliable and which were not. Physical safety was provided in networks of households where a woman in danger could find refuge, where a woman being pressured into an unwanted marriage could find temporary sanctuary while she organised her alternatives. The scale of these networks, when historians have been able to reconstruct them, is striking. Researchers working on the records of medieval London have traced mutual aid networks connecting women across more than 40 separate neighbourhoods in the city. Research on the commercial correspondence of medieval Flemish women has identified information-sharing networks that linked female traders in more than 15 cities across England, Flanders, and northern France. And the outcomes, where they can be measured, are extraordinary. Historian Martha Howell at Columbia University, whose work on women in the medieval economy is among the most rigorous we have, he found evidence suggesting that women embedded in these mutual aid networks had commercial success rates approximately 89% higher than women operating in isolation. 89%. Think about what that number means. It means that the difference between a medieval woman who had access to her community's support and one who didn't was not marginal. It was transformative. It was the difference between likely success and likely failure. The network was not a supplement to individual capability. It was a multiplier of it. The networks proved their resilience in the most extreme possible test. The Black Death. The bubonic plague that swept Europe beginning in 1347 killed, in its initial wave, somewhere between a third and half of the population of the continent. It was the most catastrophic demographic event in European history. It killed without regard to class, to piety, to gender, to professional success. It devastated communities, destroyed commercial relationships, collapsed institutional structures that had taken centuries to build. And in this context of total catastrophe, the female mutual aid networks did something remarkable. They held. Not perfectly. Nothing held perfectly in the face of the Black Death, but the records of Beguine communities in the post-plague decades show a resilience that is, given the scale of the disaster around them, striking. The communities that survived had maintained their membership records, their property documentation, their commercial relationships, their institutional knowledge. They had shared resources during the worst of the crisis. They had extended credit to members whose businesses had been disrupted. They had maintained the physical infrastructure of their communities when the surrounding city was in chaos. The women who had built these networks understood, intuitively, something that modern organizational research has spent decades trying to formalize: that resilience is not an individual property. It is a collective one. You do not survive catastrophe alone. You survive it because you have built relationships strong enough to hold under pressure, communities dense enough to catch you when you fall, networks rich enough to redistribute resources from those who have them to those who need them. The independent medieval women were, in the language we would use today, extraordinarily socially intelligent. They knew that freedom and community were not opposites, that independence and interdependence were not contradictions, that the strongest version of a self-determined life was one built not in isolation, but in deep, deliberate, mutually supportive connection with others who shared your values and your commitments. And here is the truth at the heart of all of it, the truth that the clerk in Bruges couldn't explain when he observed it in that Beguine community 800 years ago. The contentment he saw was not mysterious. It was the natural result of lives organised around the things that actually produce human flourishing: meaningful work, genuine autonomy, deep relationships, contribution to something larger than oneself, the freedom to develop and deploy one's full capabilities. These women had those things, not by accident, not by luck, by design, by the deliberate construction, over generations, of legal frameworks and institutional structures and social networks that made those things possible for women in a world that was not, by default, inclined to provide them. They were happy because they had built the conditions for happiness. And they had built those conditions because they understood, with a clarity that the world around them spent centuries trying to obscure, what those conditions actually were. Not a husband. Not social validation. Not the performance of a role assigned by a culture that had decided, for its own reasons, what female life was supposed to look like. Just this: the freedom to wake up each morning and make your own life, the support of people who saw you clearly and valued you genuinely, the satisfaction of work that was yours, the pride of a self that was, in every meaningful sense, your own. It is not complicated. It has never been complicated. It has just, for long stretches of history, been made very difficult to access. And that brings us, finally, to tonight, to you, to us, here, together, in whatever corner of the world you're in whatever quiet hour this is for you. Because the last thing I want to do before we close this journey together is bring everything we've discovered tonight across the centuries and into the present, to ask what these women's lives might mean for ours. To look honestly at the echoes, the patterns, the places where 800 years of distance collapses and the woman running her textile operation in 14th century York suddenly feels very close indeed. That conversation is next. And it's the one I've been building toward all night. What they knew that we're still learning. Let me tell you what keeps coming back to me, long after I close the books and put away the research and sit with everything we've covered tonight. It's not the specific figures, not the 23% of London property in female hands, not the 200,000 Beguines, not the 78% of Cologne's beer production. Those numbers are extraordinary, and they matter, and I want you to remember them, but they're not what stays with me most deeply. What stays with me is something simpler, something that cuts across all the centuries and all the specific stories and all the historical complexity and lands, quietly, as a single observation. These women knew something. They had figured something out. And the world spent 300 years and arguably much longer trying to make sure that knowledge didn't spread. The question I want to sit with you in these final minutes of tonight's journey is this. What exactly did they know? And what does it mean for us, here, now, in the lives we are actually living? Let's start with the modern mirror, because the patterns we've traced tonight in medieval Europe don't stay in medieval Europe. They echo, they repeat, they show up in different costumes in the world outside your window right now. Consider the language. The transformation of spinster from honourable occupational term to social insult, a transformation we traced carefully through the 15th and 16th centuries, has its direct modern equivalents. The Chinese term sheng nu, meaning leftover woman, applied to educated, professionally successful women over a certain age who remain unmarried. The Korean term old miss, the casual, slightly pitying tone that still attaches in casual conversation across many cultures to the description of a successful woman who has chosen not to marry. The persistent cultural assumption, encoded in language and social ritual and family pressure, that a woman's primary achievement is a relationship, and that professional or intellectual or economic achievement, however substantial, doesn't quite count in the same way. The medieval clerics who weaponized spinster are gone. The linguistic weapon they forged is still in circulation. Consider the economics. The systematic exclusion of women from the formal financial infrastructure of medieval Europe, the guild systems, the credit markets, the commercial networks, has its direct modern parallels. Research by the International Finance Corporation found that as recently as 2019, women-owned businesses globally faced a financing gap estimated at $320 billion annually. $320 billion of legitimate business need, unmet, specifically because the people seeking the financing were women. The mechanism is different. The vocabulary is different. The formal legal discrimination is largely gone. We have, in most of the world, moved past coverture, but the structural pattern female commercial enterprise systematically undervalued and underfinanced relative to equivalent male enterprise is recognizable. It is the same pattern, wearing different clothes. Economist Alicia Robb, whose research on gender gaps in entrepreneurial finance at the University of Colorado is among the most rigorous in the field, has documented that female entrepreneurs receive, on average, significantly less funding than male entrepreneurs at every stage of business development, across every industry category, even after controlling for business quality, sector risk, and founder experience. The medieval female merchants who built parallel credit networks because the formal markets excluded them were not solving a medieval problem. They were solving a structural problem, and the structure, in important ways, persists. Consider the health data. We talk tonight about the longevity advantage the historical record suggests for independent medieval women, about the Beguines who consistently lived decades past the medieval average, about the striking gap between what the medical establishment claimed about the dangers of female independence and what the mortality data actually showed. Here's the modern echo. Contemporary researcher Bella De Paulo, whose work I mentioned in the last chapter, has spent her career analysing the psychological and physical health outcomes of single people specifically challenging what she calls singleism, the cultural assumption that coupled life is by definition healthier, happier, and more fulfilling than single life. Her findings, drawn from decades of research across multiple methodologies, are striking in their consistency. Single women, on average, report higher levels of personal growth, autonomy, and what psychologists call self-determination than their married counterparts. They maintain larger, more diverse, and more actively maintained social networks. They report higher levels of satisfaction with their friendships and their leisure time. They demonstrate, on measures of personal development and life satisfaction, outcomes that consistently challenge the cultural narrative that equates singleness with deficiency. The medieval clerk in Bruges who couldn't explain the contentment he observed in those Beguine women had, as it turns out, stumbled onto something empirically robust. 800 years of cultural insistence that women need marriage to be fulfilled has not changed the underlying data. The independent women are still, on average, doing pretty well. Consider the networks. The mutual aid structures that independent medieval women built, the credit networks, the information sharing systems, the physical safety networks, the professional support communities were, as we've seen, extraordinarily effective. The 89% differential in commercial success rates between networked and isolated women is a number that should be burned into every discussion of female entrepreneurship, and its modern equivalent is visible everywhere you look, once you know to look for it. The explosion of women's professional networks, women's investment clubs, women's entrepreneurship communities in the past 2 decades is not a new phenomenon, it is a recovery of an old one. Women who were excluded from or underserved by the existing professional and financial infrastructure built parallel structures. Women's angel investment networks, women's business accelerators, female founder communities, mentorship networks specifically designed to connect women with the resources and relationships that the default professional infrastructure failed to provide. The Beguines would have recognized it immediately. The London commercial Sisterhood would have recognized it immediately. The medieval female guildmasters of Paris would have recognized it immediately. We did not invent this. We remembered it, or rather, we rediscovered it, because the original memory had been so thoroughly buried. And then there is the deepest pattern, the one that underlies all the others. The medieval women we've spent tonight with Margery in her wine shop, Agnes Sampson in her textile operation, Margaret Porate writing her philosophy in the knowledge that it might get her killed, Hildegard of Bingen composing symphonies and advising emperors, Alessandra Strozzi turning a failing bank into a European enterprise, Christine de Pizan building a literary career from grief and nothing else. These women were different from each other in almost every way. Different countries, different centuries, different social classes, different trades, different temperaments, different specific circumstances, but they shared something that, when you've spent enough time in their company, becomes unmistakable. They all, in some fundamental way, had decided to take themselves seriously. Not arrogantly, not aggressively, not in defiance of everyone around them, though some of them were certainly defiant when they needed to be. But at the level of basic operating assumption, they had arrived at a position that the culture around them spent enormous energy trying to prevent women from reaching, the position that their own judgment was worth trusting, that their own capabilities were real and worth deploying, that their own lives, structured according to their own values and their own sense of what mattered, were worth building. This sounds simple. It is not simple. In a world that spent 300 years pathologizing female confidence as disease, criminalizing female independence as witchcraft, linguistically transforming female capability into social failure in that world, the decision to take yourself seriously was an act of profound and consequential courage. Here is what I believe these women knew. Here is the knowledge that was considered dangerous enough to suppress and erase and burn. They knew that a life shaped around your own genuine values, your own authentic sense of what is meaningful and beautiful and worth doing, produces a quality of inner experience that a life shaped around external validation simply cannot match. They knew this not as abstract philosophy, but as lived reality, confirmed daily in the texture of their actual experience. They knew that independence and connection are not opposites, that you can be fully your own person and simultaneously embedded in deep, sustaining community. that the self-determination they had fought so hard to maintain was not isolation, it was the foundation on which genuine relationships, freely chosen rather than structurally necessary, could actually be built. They knew that the things the world told them they needed, social validation, male protection, the legitimacy that came from being someone's wife, were, in practice, frequently impediments to the things they actually needed: competence, autonomy, meaningful work, real friendship, time to think. And they knew, perhaps most importantly, that the story being told about them, the story that said they were deficient, incomplete, pitiable, sick, dangerous, deviant, was a story invented by people who found their existence threatening, not a description of reality, a political construction deployed with deliberate intent, designed to produce a specific outcome. They knew this, and some of them, not all, not without cost, not without fear, refused to believe it. The psychologist Carol Dweck at Stanford University has spent her career studying what she calls mindset, the set of underlying beliefs that shapes how people approach challenge, failure, and growth. Her research shows, with remarkable consistency, that the single most powerful predictor of whether a person will persist through difficulty and develop their capabilities over time is whether they believe those capabilities are real and worth developing. The medieval women who succeeded, who built the businesses and ran the institutions and wrote the books and composed the symphonies, did so in conditions of structural disadvantage that would have defeated most people. They succeeded, in large part, because they had arrived at a fundamental conviction about themselves that the world around them was constantly trying to dislodge. They believed they were capable, and they were right. That belief, the belief that you are capable, that your judgment is worth trusting, that your life is worth building on your own terms, was the knowledge the burning season was trying to destroy. It was the knowledge that the word spinster, weaponized, was trying to make shameful. It was the knowledge that the invented diseases were trying to pathologize. It was the knowledge that coverture, encoding female legal non-existence into the foundational structures of the law, was trying to make structurally impossible. And it survived, imperfectly, incompletely, buried under centuries of erasure, but it survived, in letters, in archives, in guild records, and court documents, and property registries, in the walls of Beguines communities that still stand in Bruges and Ghent and Amsterdam, in the music of Hildegard of Bingen, which is being performed tonight, in concerts around the world by people who find in its 800-year-old harmonies something that speaks directly to where they are right now. It survived, and here we are. Thank you. I mean that with everything I have. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey, through the wine shops of medieval London and the textile mills of Flanders, through the philosophical communities and the burning seasons and the abbeys on the Rhine. Thank you for taking these women seriously, for listening to their stories with the attention they deserve, for being curious enough and open enough to let 800 years of buried history land somewhere real. Because here's what I believe. Here's the core of what tonight has meant to me and what I hope it might mean for you. Female independence is not a modern invention. It is not a recent development, an experiment in progress, a deviation from some longer and more natural history of female dependence. It is, in fact, the older story, the story that had to be actively, violently, systematically dismantled before the story of female subordination could take its place. The women we met tonight did not have advantages we lack. They had far fewer. They operated without the legal protections we take for granted, without the educational access we take for granted, without the basic political recognition we take for granted. They operated in a world that was, in many ways, actively hostile to their existence. And they built something real, something that mattered, something that, when it was finally destroyed, left such a gap in the economic and social and intellectual life of Europe that the destruction itself is visible in the historical record as a measurable decline. What they had that we sometimes forget we have is this: the knowledge that it is possible. The evidence, 800 years deep and continent-wide, that women can build lives of genuine freedom, genuine achievement, genuine happiness, on their own terms, in community with each other. The evidence exists. It always existed. It was just buried. And the most radical thing we can do with it, the most genuinely dangerous thing, by the standards of every force that has ever tried to suppress it, is simply to remember it. Keep an eye out for our next story, where we'll be exploring another chapter of history that looks completely different once you know where to look. A world where the official record and the lived reality diverge so completely that recovering the truth feels, every time, like finding something that was never supposed to be found. I think you're going to find it absolutely fascinating. Sweet dreams, wherever you are tonight. May you wake tomorrow with the quiet, unshakable conviction of Hildegard composing in her abbey, of Agnes negotiating in her guild hall, of Christine writing in her scriptorium at dawn, the conviction that your life, built on your own terms, in full possession of your own capabilities, in genuine community with the people who see you clearly, is not just possible, it is yours. It has always been yours. It was just waiting for you to remember.